The year was 1980. Cambodia was a land in ruins, its people staggering out of the shadows of genocide, only to find themselves trapped between wars, famine, and exile. The Khmer Rouge had left the land littered with skulls. The Vietnamese occupation brought its own hardships, and for hundreds of thousands, survival meant escape. They crossed jungles, rivers, and battlefields with nothing but their will to live. Many walked toward the Thai border, hoping to find sanctuary on the other side. But what awaited them at Dangrek Mountain was not refugiate with death. Forced at gunpoint by Thai soldiers, over 40,000 refugees were driven down sheer cliffs into a minefield, a descent into horror that history remembers as one of the darkest refugee tragedies of the modern age. This is not just a story of borders and politics. It is a story of desperation, betrayal, and silence. Tonight, we return to Dangrek Mountain to remember the forgotten dead. Part 1. The Cliff of Desperation. The Cambodian refugees of 1980 had already endured the unimaginable. For 4 years, under Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge regime, they had lived through forced labor, starvation, executions, and the collapse of society itself. Families were separated, temples were desecrated, entire villages erased. When Vietnamese forces toppled the Khmer Rouge in January 1979, the survivors emerged into a devastated country, one where hunger stalked every corner and Khmer Rouge remnants still roamed the forests. For many, staying in Cambodia meant certain death. Word spread that Thailand might be a place of safety, and so began the great exodus westward. The journey to the border was itself a nightmare. People walked barefoot across scorched earth, carrying what little they had left in sacks and baskets. Infants were slung against mothers' chests, the elderly leaned on sticks, and children often carried siblings on their backs. Food was scarce. Many survived on roots, leaves, and the occasional handful of rice. The monsoon rains turned paths into rivers of mud. Those who fell behind often did not rise again, yet they kept walking, driven by the hope that just beyond the border, perhaps, there would be refuge. Dangrek Mountain stood like a wall between Cambodia and Thailand. For generations, it had been a natural boundary, a rugged, forested escarpment that seemed to rise endlessly into the sky. To the exhausted refugees, it was both a promise and a threat. Beyond it lay Thailand, but to reach it meant climbing its steep trails, scaling cliffs, and threading paths choked with vegetation. Some carried family members on bamboo stretchers. Others carried memories of those they had already lost. Each step upward was a battle against exhaustion, hunger, and fear. At first, whispers spread among the refugees. Once we cross into Thailand, they will take care of us. But the reality awaiting them was far more sinister. Thailand's government and military saw the Cambodian exodus not as a humanitarian crisis, but as a burden, even a threat. The Cold War had turned Southeast Asia into a chessboard of superpowers. Vietnam, now Cambodia's occupier, was allied with the Soviet Union. Thailand, fearful of Vietnamese expansion, aligned itself with the United States and China. In this volatile balance, the refugees were caught as pawns. To Thai authorities, they were not human beings fleeing genocide, but a tide of unwanted mouths to feed, a security risk, and a political problem. And so, as thousands climbed Dangrek Mountain and crossed into Thai territory, Thai troops received orders not to shelter them, but to push them back. No international law protected the refugees then. No safe corridor existed. No humanitarian organization had the power to shield them from what would come next. They had walked into the hands of soldiers who saw them as enemies. Eyewitnesses recall the moment Thai troops appeared on the ridges. Refugees who had staggered into Thailand, thinking they were safe, were surrounded by armed men in fatigues. The soldiers shouted orders, their rifles pointed at unarmed families. Mothers held their children close. Fathers raised their hands in supplication, but mercy was not given. Soldiers drove the refugees back toward the cliffs with shouts, threats, and bayonets. Panic spread through the crowd. Where could they go? Behind them lay Cambodia, a land still scarred by Khmer Rouge, guerrillas, and war. Before them, the cliffs of Dangrek plunged into the abyss. The order was clear: drive them down. The refugees were herded to the edge. Some pleaded with soldiers to spare their children. Others tried to resist, only to be struck with rifle butts or kicked down the slope. In one haunting testimony, a survivor remembered the terror of seeing the cliffs stretch endlessly downward, jagged rocks below glinting like teeth. There was no path, only a steep drop into uncertainty. And yet, with soldiers pressing from behind, they had no choice. Step by step, families began their descent into the abyss. The mountain swallowed them. The descent was chaos, people slipping on loose rocks, tumbling into each other, clutching branches for support that snapped in their hands. The cries of children echoed against the cliffs. Those who lost their footing fell and vanished into the trees below. Mothers carried infants in slings, trying to shield them as they slid down on hands and knees. Old men crawled, their skin torn by thorns and stones. At every moment, death seemed inches away. But the mountain itself was not the greatest danger. At its base lay something worse, a minefield. Years of war between Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam had turned the land into a killing ground, laced with hidden explosives. Mines had no mercy, no allegiance, no warning. And into this lethal ground the refugees were forced. The first explosions shattered the night. Survivors recalled the thunder of detonations, the blinding flashes of fire, the screams that followed. A man carrying his wife watched her body torn apart before his eyes. A mother clutching a baby was struck by a blast, leaving only silence where their cries had been. The minefield consumed them indiscriminately, young and old, strong and weak. Panic turned into stampede. People ran blindly, stepping into death at every turn. The earth itself seemed to be at war with them. The air filled with smoke, dust, and screams. Children cried for parents who would never rise again. Families were ripped apart in an instant. Survivors described the ground littered with bodies, some motionless, others writhing in agony, missing limbs, begging for water. The soldiers above watched, their rifles raised, ensuring that no one tried to climb back. This was not an accident of war. It was an execution by geography. Thailand had chosen the mountain as its weapon, the minefield as its accomplice. In one night, thousands were annihilated, not in battle, but in flight. As dawn broke over the cliffs of Dangrek, the landscape had been transformed into a vision of hell. Bodies lay strewn across the slopes, families huddled beside the wounded, the cries of the dying mixing with the morning birdsong. The mountain had become a mass grave. Survivors pressed onward into Cambodia, broken and bleeding, carrying the fragments of their families on their backs. This was the cliff of desperation. It was the moment when hope itself turned deadly, when sanctuary became slaughter. The refugees had climbed toward life, only to be delivered into death. And the world, watching from a distance, did nothing. Part 2: Into the minefield. The refugees had been driven from the cliff, herded like cattle by the rifles and boots of Thai soldiers. Now, at the foot of the Dangrek escarpment, they found themselves standing on ground that was not ground at all. It was death disguised as soil. The Khmer Rouge had mined these approaches years earlier during their retreat from Vietnamese forces, turning the very earth into a trap. What lay ahead was not sanctuary, but a killing field, hidden beneath leaves and dust. At first, the refugees did not realize what was happening. Parents clutched their children, urging them forward, believing this valley might lead deeper into Cambodia, perhaps to villages where food or safety could be found. But then came the first explosion, thunderous roar, followed by a shriek that tore the silence apart. A young boy disappeared into a flash of smoke, his small body flung like a rag doll, limbs torn apart in an instant. Blood sprayed across the people nearest him. Mothers screamed, fathers staggered backward, but the soldiers shouted from above, gesturing with rifles, forcing them to keep moving. The panic spread as more explosions ripped through the line. With every step forward, another mine detonated. Some refugees froze, too terrified to move, while others surged blindly, hoping to outrun death itself. But there was no outrunning the minefield. It stretched wide across the landscape, a patchwork of hidden bombs waiting to claim their victims. The refugees were not walking into safety, they were walking into a massacre that unfolded one explosion at a time. Imagine the scene from above. Thousands of desperate people stumbling through dust and smoke, bodies crumpling into the dirt, cries echoing into the dry mountain air. The lucky ones who avoided the mines tripped over the corpses of those who had not. Children ran in circles, calling for parents who would never answer again. In the chaos, families were ripped apart not by enemy soldiers this time, but by the invisible weapons buried beneath their feet. It was not just the explosions that killed. The wounded were often left where they fell. A woman who lost her leg screamed as blood gushed from the stump, begging for someone to help. But her neighbors, equally terrified, could only stumble onward, knowing that stopping to give aid might mean triggering another mine. Her cries grew weaker until only silence remained. The minefield had not only destroyed her body, had forced her community to abandon her, to save themselves. Those who survived each blast carried their trauma forward. Some clutched the burned, broken bodies of loved ones, refusing to leave them behind until soldiers' voices from above but commanding forced them to drop the corpses and continue into the field of death. A father held the lifeless body of his daughter, refusing to move until another explosion nearby knocked him to the ground, leaving him dazed and bleeding. When he rose again, the girl's body was gun-swallowed by dust, by chaos, by the endless tide of human misery pressing forward. The land itself seemed to mock the refugees. Grass and leaves covered the mines, disguising their presence with the innocent beauty of nature. Every patch of earth could be death. Every step was a gamble. In this way, the minefield did not just kill, it terrorized. It forced the people to live every moment on the edge of annihilation. Some whispered prayers with each step, invoking the names of ancestors. Others clenched their teeth, saying nothing, their eyes glazed with shock. The air smelled of blood, dirt, and the acrid smoke of exploded metal. As hours turned into days, the minefield became a graveyard. The corpses lay scattered across the terrain, limbs twisted, torsos ripped apart, heads half buried in soil. Survivors had no choice but to step over them, their feet brushing against the bodies of neighbors, friends, and kin. Children walked barefoot over this horror, too numb to weep anymore. Buzzards circled above, drawn to the feast below. The earth was littered with reminders that there would be no peace, here only a slow death or a haunted survival. The Thai soldiers, stationed safely above the cliffs, watched from a distance. They had forced the refugees into this death zone and now simply waited for the problem to resolve itself. To them, the refugees were a burden, a threat, an inconvenience in a region already strained by war. Pushing them back into the minefield was a way to make them someone else's problem, to erase their presence without pulling triggers directly. But whether or not the soldiers fired their weapons, the result was the same. Cambodian men, women, and children died by the thousands. Those who managed to cross stretches of the minefield often found themselves herded again, driven further into zones controlled by the Khmer Rouge. There, the cycle of suffering continued, as the very killers they had tried to escape months before now appeared as the only option for survival. The refugees were trapped between two cruelties. Behind them, Thai soldiers and minefields. Ahead of them, the Khmer Rouge and the nightmare of war. It was a corridor of death, with no true exit. Personal stories from survivors later revealed the unbearable decisions people had to make in those days. A mother, carrying 2 children, stepped on a mine. The explosion tore her body apart, but one child survived injured, but alive. The other, still in her arms, was killed instantly. The surviving child wandered aimlessly for 2 days, clinging to the tattered sleeve of her mother's clothing, until another family finally pulled her along. Elsewhere, a father abandoned his teenage son after the boy lost his legs to a blast. The father wept as he walked away, knowing there was no way to carry his child without dooming them both. These choices became the inheritance of Dangrek Mountain, the inheritance of guilt, of trauma, of memories too painful to speak aloud. Journalists who later tried to document the crisis described scenes of unimaginable horror. Photographs captured lines of refugees descending rocky cliffs, their faces gaunt and exhausted, only to disappear into smoke-filled fields where explosions echoed like thunder. Survivors who reached camps beyond the minefields carried haunted eyes. Some refused to speak at all. Others told fragments of stories of brothers lost in explosions, of children swallowed by the ground, of nights lit by the flames of burning bodies when survivors tried to cremate their dead with scraps of wood. These testimonies stitched together a picture of tragedy on a scale that words could never fully capture. For the international community, reports of the crisis trickled out slowly. Aid organizations heard rumors of the pushbacks, but few were allowed access to the actual killing grounds. By the time news began to spread, thousands were already dead. Yet the politics of the Cold War silenced outrage. Thailand remained an ally of Western powers, seen as a bulwark against communism in Southeast Asia. The refugees' suffering was noted, but rarely condemned in ways that mattered. The people of Dangrek became ghosts, sacrificed not only to mines but to geopolitics. Meanwhile, the minefield did its work without mercy. Day after day, week after week, refugees continued to stumble into its jaws. The Thai military made little effort to clear the paths or provide safe passage. The goal was not to save lives, it was to deter the living from ever coming back. In this sense, the minefield was not just a weapon of war. It was a message, a warning that Cambodia's suffering belonged to Cambodia alone, and that those who tried to escape it would find no sanctuary beyond the cliffs. As the days passed, the survivors thinned. Some perished from wounds that festered without medical care. Others starved, cut off from food supplies. Mothers gave the last drops of water to their children, only to collapse in exhaustion and never rise again. The survivors who did make it through carried scars, both visible and hidden: burned flesh, missing limbs, broken minds. Many would never truly recover. The ghosts of Dangrek would haunt them until their last breaths. The tragedy of the minefield lies not only in the lives it claimed, but in the deliberate cruelty of its use. It was not an accident. It was not the blind chaos of war. It was a choice. Refugees were forced into it by human hands, by orders, by policies that treated human beings as expendable. And once they were inside, the world looked away. Each explosion was not just a detonation of metal and fire, it was the sound of humanity's failure echoing across the cliffs. By the end of the crisis, tens of thousands had been forced into this landscape of death. Thousands never emerged. Their bones remained buried beneath the soil of Dangrek Mountain, mingled with the rusting fragments of mines. The survivors carried their memories across borders, into camps, into exile, into generations that would inherit the silence of their trauma. For Cambodia, the minefield became not just a physical barrier, but a symbol of abandonment, a reminder that when the people cried out for help, the world let them walk into fire. This was not merely an episode of suffering. It was an engineered disaster, carried out under the shadow of politics and fear. And for the refugees who stumbled through the dust, the screams, and the endless thunder of mines, it became the darkest passage of their lives, a passage that no human being should ever have been forced to endure. Part 3: The Wound of Memory. The minefield of Dangrek Mountain had claimed its toll, and those who survived emerged into a world that barely noticed their suffering. For the tens of thousands who had been pushed from the cliffs into the fields of death, the ordeal was not only a story of bodies broken, but of memories branded into their minds forever. In Cambodia, trauma had already layered upon trauma: the Khmer Rouge's genocide, the Vietnamese invasion, the chaos of displacement, and now this, another scar written into the soul of a people abandoned in their hour of desperation. In the refugee camps that eventually formed on safer ground, survivors carried with them not only wounds, but stories. stories that bled in whispers. Children huddled in bamboo huts, asking mothers why their siblings had not returned. Men stared silently at the ground, refusing to speak of the moment when the earth itself had exploded beneath their families. Women clutched at the ghosts of infants who had been torn from their arms by landmines. These camps were places of survival, yes, but they were also graveyards of the mind. The Dangrek tragedy had followed the people there, invisible but heavy, pressing on every breath they took. The world, meanwhile, offered sympathy in words, but little else in action. International aid groups recorded testimonies, journalists photographed the shattered remains of lives, and foreign governments filed reports, but accountability never came. The Thai soldiers who had forced the refugees down the cliffs were not tried, nor even shamed in their own nation. The minefield remained long after the exodus, silently killing farmers, wanderers, and children for decades to come. For Cambodia, there was no justice, only survival. The silence of the world was deafening, and in that silence, the survivors bore their grief alone. The trauma of Dangrek became generational. Children who survived carried memories of parents blown apart before their eyes. Those who grew up in the camps carried the fear of explosions in their very bodies, flinching at loud noises, waking in the night from dreams filled with dust and fire. Many of these children grew into adults with a distrust of borders, of soldiers, of governments that had promised safety and delivered death. They raised families of their own, passing down the unspoken weight of Dangrek like a shadow inherited at birth. Even decades later, Cambodian communities abroad tell fragments of these stories in hushed voices, unable to completely silence the past, unable to completely speak it. In Cambodia itself, the mountain remains a symbol of betrayal. Dangrek is not just a geographic boundary, it's a wound. It represents the moment when desperate people discovered that escape could be deadlier than the war they fled. It symbolizes the cruelty of geopolitics, where human lives were pawns on a chessboard larger than themselves. Thailand, seeking to control its borders and appease its military establishment, chose the easiest path. Pushed the problem back into Cambodia, no matter the cost in human blood, and the great powers of the world, locked in Cold War calculations, accepted it. For them, the refugees were collateral, insignificant next to the balance of communism and capitalism. The mountain was allowed to consume its victims because their deaths served no larger interest to those who ruled beyond. But for the survivors, Dangrek was not abstract politics. It was the smell of burning flesh as makeshift funeral pyres lit up the night sky. It was the sight of loved ones disappearing in clouds of dust. It was the silence that followed when the screaming stopped and there was no one left to call for help. These memories became the inheritance of the Cambodian nation, layered on top of genocide and exile. Every Cambodian who lived through those years carried not only their own survival, but the silence of those who did not. Time did not heal these wounds. If anything, time deepened them. As years turned into decades, the survivors scattered. Some rebuilt lives in the refugee camps, later resettled in the United States, France, Australia, or Canada. Others remained along the border, trapped between worlds. But wherever they went, the minefield followed them in memory. Many could never speak of it openly. Those who did often found their words met with disbelief. How could the world accept that tens of thousands of people had been pushed into a minefield by soldiers, that they had been abandoned like cattle to slaughter, that such an atrocity had happened in plain sight? Silence became easier than truth, but silence is its own prison. In Cambodia today, Dangrek Mountain still looms in the landscape, a silent witness to the crime. Farmers cultivate land nearby, children play on slopes, monks chant prayers in villages. But beneath the soil, remnants of the mines remain, some still active, waiting with mechanical patience for the footstep of the unlucky. Even decades later, people die in those hills. Each detonation is not only the death of one more Cambodian, is the echo of 1980, the echo of the Great Forced March, the echo of the moment when the border became a grave. For the Thai state, The Dangrek tragedy is often erased from official memory. To acknowledge it would be to admit complicity in mass death. In history books, it is absent or reduced to vague language about border security. The silence is deliberate, meant to protect reputations and alliances. Yet history does not disappear so easily. Survivors still remember. Cambodians still remember. And so long as one person carries the memory, Dangrek cannot be buried under silence. The dead cry out through the living, and the soil itself bears witness. In the broader story of Cambodia's suffering, Dangrek might seem like one chapter among many. The Khmer Rouge genocide, the famine, the wars with Vietnam, the displacement of millions, these are monumental tragedies in themselves. But Dangrek is unique. It was not a tragedy of civil war, nor the chaos of revolution. It was a deliberate act of rejection. Refugees sought sanctuary, and sanctuary turned them away with bullets, cliffs, and mines. It was not war that killed them, it was the cold calculation of policy, the cruelty of nations deciding who is human enough to deserve safety. In this way, Dangrek is not only Cambodian history, it is a warning to the world of what happens when borders become more important than lives. And yet, amidst the horror, there were sparks of resilience. Survivors tell stories of strangers carrying wounded children, of old women offering their last food to mothers with infants, of monks whispering prayers over the dead when no one else would stop. Humanity survived in fragments, even when governments abandoned it entirely. These small acts of kindness did not erase the cruelty, but they stood as defiance against it. In a place designed to strip away dignity, some people still managed to hold on to it. These fragments are what kept some survivors alive, not just in body, but in spirit. The wound of Dangrek will never fully close. It remains in Cambodian memory as a reminder of suffering, betrayal, and resilience. But memory itself is dangerous. Nations like Thailand prefer silence. Great powers prefer to forget. Yet to forget is to kill again, to erase the dead a second time. That is why the story of Dangrek must be told, not to dwell in grief, but to honor those who had no graves but the minefield. Their suffering must not vanish into the dust of history. The mountain speaks through the survivors, and through us, as we recall its dark story. As we close this chapter, imagine the silence of the Dangrek cliffs today. The birds sing, the wind rustles through trees, and the earth lies quiet. But beneath that calm lies a hidden graveyard. Beneath that calm lies the memory of explosions, screams, and fire. Beneath that calm lies the story of a people abandoned at the edge of the world. To tell this story is to pierce that silence, to remind the living that the past is not gone, it waits, like the mines themselves, beneath the surface. Dangrek Mountain is not just geography, it is memory. It is a wound that bleeds through generations, and it demands that we remember not only for Cambodia, but for every refugee who has been turned away, every survivor who has been told that their life is expendable. The cliffs of Dangrek stand as a monument to cruelty, but also as a warning. When borders are guarded with hatred instead of compassion, the earth itself becomes a weapon. History may not bring justice, but history can bring memory, and memory is the first step toward dignity, toward humanity, toward preventing the repetition of such horrors. The survivors of Dangrek carry that memory, scarred into their souls. We carry it now as well, by telling their story. For if silence protected the perpetrators, then truth is the only weapon the dead have left. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history.